So now let's look at how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported through the blood between the lungs and the tissues of the body. So we know that oxygen diffuses into the blood from the alveoli, and we said that that happens because of the difference in partial pressures. We talked about that. Once that oxygen gets into the blood, most of it is going to enter into the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. So almost 99% of it will enter into those erythrocytes and bind to iron that's found in hemoglobin. Now, once it binds to hemoglobin, that hemoglobin is now called oxyhemoglobin. And we know that each hemoglobin unit has 4 heme groups, 4 molecules of iron, and each one of those can bind to an oxygen molecule. So total, each hemoglobin molecule can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. And we know the rest of the oxygen will be dissolved in the plasma, but again, that's less than 2%. Now, carbon monoxide is a poisonous gas that can also bind to iron, and it actually has a much higher affinity for binding to that iron than oxygen does. So if you're exposed to carbon monoxide gas, that carbon monoxide will basically steal those oxygen binding sites and prevent oxygen from being able to bind to hemoglobin, and you would eventually suffocate. So this could be fatal if you're exposed to carbon monoxide in high levels. Now we know that carbon dioxide is going to be transported in a different way. About 5% of it will bind to proteins like hemoglobin and plasma albumin, but that's a very small percentage. Another 5% will be transported as dissolved gas in the plasma, and the remaining 90%, which is how most of the carbon dioxide will be transported, is as a bicarbonate ion. Okay, so the way that this happens is the carbon dioxide enters into the blood, it goes into the red blood cells, and it reacts with water to form carbonic acid, this guy here. And then that carbonic acid will dissociate into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Now again, this reaction is mostly going to occur inside of the red blood cells, and an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase will kind of speed this process up. But once these bicarbonate ions have formed, they will then diffuse out of the red blood cells and into the plasma, and that is how they will be transported. Typically is through the blood plasma. So now let's look at internal respiration. This is where we see gas exchange between the blood capillaries and the tissues of the body. So this is where we're going to be unloading oxygen from the blood into the tissues, and we're going to be loading that carbon dioxide that's being produced by the tissues back into the blood. So we know that carbon dioxide levels that are arriving at the tissues in the blood are about 40, whereas the carbon dioxide levels in the tissues are about 46. So you can see that those carbon dioxide molecules want to diffuse from the tissues into the blood capillaries down that gradient from high to low. And that carbon dioxide will then be transported back towards the lungs. We know that unloading of oxygen and loading of carbon dioxide is going to happen at the tissues. We need to unload oxygen, and the oxygen levels are going to be higher in the blood capillaries. They're going to be about 95 compared to about 40 in the tissues. So that oxygen will move from a high pressure to a low as well. And when it needs to leave those red blood cells, it has to dissociate from that oxyhemoglobin, kind of break apart from the hemoglobin, and then it can diffuse out of the blood and into the tissues where it can be used by those cells. Now, the amount of oxygen that gets unloaded by the blood is not going to be constant at all times. It's going to be different depending on whether you are at rest or whether you're exercising, for instance. So if you're exercising, more oxygen will be unloaded than normal, and that's because you need more oxygen in those tissues when you're exercising, in places like your skeletal muscle, for instance. So you will typically see more oxygen being unloaded during those types of situations when you are more active. So active tissues we know will consume oxygen very, very quickly, right? They're using that oxygen up to make ATP, which lowers the oxygen levels in the tissue even more. So now we have an even bigger pressure difference, a bigger pressure gradient, which is going to speed up that diffusion rate between the blood and those tissues. We also know that active tissues are going to make more carbon dioxide, so that's going to increase that pressure gradient as well. There's going to be a higher pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissues than normal in those active tissues, which is going to speed up the diffusion rate of the carbon dioxide from those tissues into the blood. Now we know that pulmonary ventilation can change to adjust for the body's rate of carbon dioxide production and demand for oxygen. And so the main thing that's going to kind of stimulate a change in breathing rate or a change in pulmonary ventilation is your blood's pH. So your blood's pH can change throughout the day depending on what's going on. And then so your respiratory system will respond to that. If the blood becomes too acidic, we try to remove more carbon dioxide from the blood to adjust. If the blood is too basic or alkaline, we try to retain carbon dioxide to adjust the blood pH. So that's kind of the main contributing factor to how your pulmonary ventilation is going to be functioning from minute to minute, is really the pH level of the blood. After that, then we look at CO2 levels. Those can affect, pulmonary ventilation rate as well. And then after that, we're going to look at oxygen levels. So again, if the blood pH is too low, let's say it's less than 7.35, your body will respond by increasing your breathing rate and increasing breathing depth to help you get rid of more carbon dioxide from the body. Because when carbon dioxide accumulates in the body, it leads to a more acidic pH. So the more carbon dioxide you have in your blood, the more acidic the blood pH will be. So if we eliminate more of that carbon dioxide, we can raise the pH. And just the opposite, if your blood is too alkaline, that means you don't have enough carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, or something else is going on. But what we can do to adjust that is by increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the blood, and that will make the blood more acidic. It will lower the pH of the blood back to normal. Now, the effect of oxygen on pulmonary ventilation is not going to play a very big role. It's not really going to have very much effect. Again, the main things that are going to affect pulmonary ventilation or breathing rate are going to be blood pH and carbon dioxide levels, our need to eliminate carbon dioxide from the body. So you guys take a look at this. If you have any questions about gas transport or respiration, internal respiration, please let me know.